So this is our fourth class of Bible geography, and the adage is true more than ever that a pastor is a jack of all trades and master of none. So what do I know about geology and archaeology and geography? Not a whole lot in comparison to those who spend their lives studying it. And you could spend your whole life studying any of those fields. So we understand that, but just to understand the difference between these fields of study, it's good for us to even consider this just as we get into this, because we will be looking at some aspects of geology and archaeology in this class, but it's a Bible geography class. So geology and geography are two fields that study Earth from a scientific point of view. Geography is the study of the physical features of the Earth and its atmosphere and of human activity as it affects and is it affected by these, including the distribution of populations, resources, land use, and industries. So tonight, really, we're going to consider two major aspects of geography. One, the flood. And think about the flood, the physical features of the Earth and its atmosphere. So that's what changed at the flood. And I was kind of a little miffed why he didn't have anything about the flood in our book. So I've added that to our study. And also the table of nations, which really shows how the nations of the world spread upon the Earth. So that's geography. Geology is really just studying the physical structure of the Earth itself, the components of the Earth and what it's made of. Basically, that's what this is saying. The physical structure, substance of the Earth, the history, the processes which act on them. It's a branch of natural science that studies processes and patterns in the natural environment. So really, as we look at the flood tonight, we're going to overlap too with geology and how the flood affected the Earth itself. But it relates. Isn't that interesting? I thought that was an interesting relationship between these two things. Then archaeology, just if you're curious, archaeology is the study of human history and prehistory through the excavation of sites. So archaeology really focuses on digging down and seeing, who lived there, what kind of stuff did they use, pottery, furniture, or what are their artifacts in the excavation of sites, physical remains, and things like that. That's archaeology. So that gives us kind of and I think that Bible geography does obviously relate to the study of archaeology as well, because it relates to what we just mentioned, the idea of human activity. So really the main thing that I get from this is geography is really how humans interact, with the Earth itself. Whereas geology is just a study of the elements of the Earth, and archaeology is digging down into the Earth to find. So that's kind of like the general idea. So with that in mind, let's review, because this is very important that we, as far as the geography of the land, and I know some of these terms are new to us, but they have to become like, we have to know them like the back of our hand. So the coastal plain is this region right alongside, right up and down the coast of Israel, the coastal plain. And then this is called the what? The hill country. So Judah is down here when the kingdoms were divided. Remember, the kingdom was divided into Judah and Israel, and in the New Testament, Samaria. So remember where the Jewish people in Jesus' day did not go through Samaria. They would come down from Jerusalem and probably travel up this highway and cut across that way in order to avoid going through Samaria, because it was also hill country, difficult traveling. But Jesus traveled this way. Jesus traveled through these mountains and hills. Okay, so you have the hill country, then you have the what? The Rift Valley. And what are the two major bodies of water in this Rift Valley? The Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, right? Okay, the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and the Rift Valley. And then you have the Transjordan, or the Eastern Plateau. And of course, great men like Elijah came from there. And remember when two and a half tribes actually were across the river in this area of the Jordan, Transjordan, when Joshua divided the land, 2.5 of the tribes stayed on that side. Okay, so that's very important for us to review that for just that moment. And then these two other, I thought these were two very important areas of the land of Israel, in addition to those 4 major longitudinal designations, were the Shephelah, which was this buffer region between the coastal plain and the hill country. So it was getting up into the mountains, and a lot of important things happened here in Bible history. David fought Goliath, Samson did his exploits, and so forth. So a lot of things happened. A lot of battles were fought here because remember we talked about how when Babylon and Assyria came down from Mesopotamia, they would come down this international coastal highway and then attack cities in the Shephelah in order to then come against Jerusalem. So these cities here were very important to the protection of Jerusalem in Bible days. So we see some of these cities like Lachish is mentioned in Bible history. So Shephelah, that's a very important. And then I think the other very important region is what? What's that called? The what? The Jezreel Valley, and it's this triangular area. What really famous place is in the Jezreel Valley? The Valley of Armageddon. Armageddon. Megiddo is in this area where many major battles. And why were major battles fought here? Again, because it was right in the way of what? The international coastal highway. So if you could control these trade routes, you could control a lot of money and things passing by, and you could make people pay taxes if you could control these trade routes, and they would pay taxes to you. So we're going to actually see that in the first major war of human history. It was really in order to get other people to pay taxes to Chedorlaomer and these kings. We'll see that in the days of Abraham. Okay, so these are the major areas that we want to say, remember. So let's say them again. The coastal plain, the hill country, the Jordan Rift, and the Transjordan or Eastern Plateau. And then over here is the Shephelah, and up here is the Jezreel Valley. Okay, so that's important. Now we're not going to be there yet. We're actually in the beginnings now, and we'll look we'll kind of follow our book a little bit here for beginnings. And number one under that is the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden. And he has a little section in our book on page number 35 right along the side. What does the Garden of Eden mean? It means, what does the Garden of Eden mean? We're on page 17 in our notes, page 17. What does it mean? You guys got the notes? Page 17, the notes are on the back on the back chairs. It means delight. Thank you, Edgar. So make sure we're all in the right place. Could you please get Jeannie some notes? Hi, Jeannie. Hi. How you doing? It's a little windy out there tonight. Okay, so the Garden of Eden means delight. And he has a nice little section in our book about the Garden of Eden. It was a well-watered place, and of course, this is where human life began. This was the garden that God made, and he put his first humans, Adam and Eve, whom he made in his image, in his likeness. And the Garden of Eden had 4 major rivers. And those 4 rivers, when came off of a major river, it says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 10, notice the geography of the Garden of Eden. Of course, there were trees, abundance of trees. And there was 2 famous trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But verse 10 says, Genesis 2:10, a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became 4 heads. And the 4 heads of that river are in verse 11. The name of the first is Pison. So that's the blank there in letter B. The Pison. We don't know of that river. And then after that, it talks about, there was gold in that land. That was a nice land. Where there is gold. The gold was good there. Wouldn't we like to know where that is? What's the next river? Actually, I spelled it incorrectly there. Why do I always find these mistakes when I'm here? It says in our King James Bible that Gihon, Gihon, yeah, the same as that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. The name of the third river is the... Oh, I'm sorry. The name of the third is the Hiddekel. That is that which goes toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. So actually, I'm sorry. It should be the Hiddekel and the Euphrates. And you know what I was doing? I was following our book. That's why the book says Pishon, Gihon, the Tigris. Maybe there's just another name for the Hiddekel is Tigris. But the thing that's interesting here is, where is the Garden of Eden today? And he tries to get into that, and he answers it a little bit. But the thing is, since it was before the flood, and the flood changed the geography of the earth, for one, we're not exactly sure where it is, but he does mention the Tigris and the Euphrates River here. He also mentions Ethiopia, but he posits that either the Garden of Eden was somewhere in the Armenian mountains, not far from where Mount Ararat is, or in southern Mesopotamia, where I would probably tend to think that, but we don't know. There's no way that we could possibly know. But that there was the Euphrates River there, it could well have been in this region that we've been looking at, the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamian region. Okay, so that's just a little of that. Okay? So let's move on, and then on to the next page. He talks about, now, I just put an X just to let you know, you don't have to know them, and I'm not really that interested in this. For the sake of this class, he talks about these different periods on page 34 and 35. We're not even going to consider those things. Lithic means stone, so this is what archaeologists, and many of them evolutionary type archaeologists or secular archaeologists would call stone ages. Lithic means stone. So I did, and that's why I really didn't understand why he had those periods of time, and even dating back to 15,000 BC, where I believe actually creation was around 4,000 BC, and we could actually date it based on the genealogy of Seth. And I don't know why he includes these Stone Age periods of time, which is not biblical, and then he does not include the flood. So, every book is going to have some weaknesses to it. So I point it out as a weakness. So that's why I say, well, I'm not concerned about these things because it's not biblical geography. And as we go to the next page, the rise and decline of early civilizations, the early Bronze Age, which is really dated. Now we're coming right around the period of where the flood would have been. And so he calls this period of time an urban revolution. Well, that would have been after the flood. And that's where he talks then on the next page, the table of nations. So this is really the start of human history as we know it. So letter A in your notes would be the worldwide flood. And this, of course, is Genesis chapters 6 through 9. And again, we're not going to get into every nitty-gritty here, but I wanted to just hit as an overview. If you have any questions or comments, you can. But I think the key verses to consider about the flood are in chapter 7. If you could go to Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. And Anna, could you please read that for us, please? Genesis chapter 7 and verse number 11 and 12, please.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken out, and the windows of the heavens were opened. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
Okay, so now that's very significant. It tells us the exact day the rains began when Noah went into the ark. And then in chapter 8, it will tell us the exact day that Noah came out of the ark. So we'll see that. So here we see the worldwide flood. Now, it's described here, the first thing about the flood wasn't the rain. That's, I think, very significant. It was what? What does it say in that verse? The fountains of the great deep were opened up. That's the first element of tremendous significance upon the earth of the flood. So in your notes, I put here that there was an incredible rupturing of the earth's deep interior. And that's what triggered this event. And then this resulted or led to, and I'm not a scientist either, we weren't there to know whether there was just natural causes that God brought to the earth, or whether he just himself put his finger upon the earth and it happened in some kind of a miraculous judgment against the earth. But nevertheless, the first element of this flood was this deep rupturing, this fissuring of the great deep. And then 40 days of torrential rains. It says what? The windows of heaven were opened. So remember that the earth was once covered with water, was it not?
Yes.
For the first day, and then the second day. And then it wasn't until the third day that God made the dry land to appear. So God is just bringing the earth back to its primeval state, in a sense. So we should not even think that this is not impossible at all, because the earth had been covered with water previous. Now, what was the state of the earth when it was covered with water? Remember, when God made the firmament, he divided the waters. In Genesis, going back to chapter 1, he divided the waters under the heavens, or the atmosphere, from the waters which were above the atmosphere, or the firmament. And it was so. So God put some kind of a vapor canopy around the earth on that second day. And I believe that's why people were able to live long periods of time, to shield the earth from the radiation of the sun. And it was almost like Henry Morris and others believe this, that the earth was covered with this vapor canopy, made the earth kind of like a huge greenhouse. There were universally warm temperatures. There wasn't a North Pole and a South Pole as we know it. The geography and the atmosphere of the earth was different from what it is today. It was another heaven and an earth, 2 Peter tells us. And the flood destroyed that heaven and earth, and now we have another heaven and the earth. So it was that heaven and earth was destroyed with what? By water. And this heaven and earth is going to be destroyed with fire. Okay, so whatever was going on there, people could live a long period of time. So what happened at the flood is the earth started to rupture, and then that vapor canopy around the earth was just unleashed upon the earth. So Noah and his family were then in the ark during that period of time. Must have been pretty frightening, with earthquakes and tsunamis going on in the water, and just water everywhere. But they were in the hand of God. They were in the ark, it tells us, for a total of 371 days. 371, that's the blank there at number 1. 371. 371 days, which is 1 year and 11 days. Just over 1 year, they were in the ark. So again, the flood wasn't just 40 days of rain and then they were in the ark for over a year. So number 2 there was worldwide volcanic action. That accompanied this deluge as the water vapor canopy surrounded the earth was unleashed upon the earth. So can you imagine, I really believe there was 40 days of like all kinds of volcanic action, mountain making activity going on as volcanoes were rupturing. And there are volcanic islands all around the world made of igneous rock, and I believe a lot of them were formed during the flood. So the result of the flood, as I mentioned, is it remade the heaven and the atmosphere and the earth from what it was before. Letter A, there's a blank here. The atmosphere was no longer universally warm, as the thermal vapor blanket dissipated. Stormy winds and rain and snow are now possible. Remember, before that, there was like almost a mist. And however that mist was on the earth, it was a sufficient form of precipitation, because remember that river went out of the Garden of Eden and it fed the tributaries. So it didn't rain as we know it to rain today, but this precipitation that was there was sufficient for them, of course, to be very comfortable. But after the flood, I believe that then you had that ice age actually happen. We talk about an ice age. Well, the North and South poles developed and glaciers began to form, and the atmosphere was different. And that they find fossil graveyards in cold climates, And how could that be? Except if the earth was not at one time universally warm, and that there wasn't a worldwide flood that covered buried millions of living things that became dead and then they became fossils. And then I believe the flood resulted in ocean basins. I'm on page 18 now. Ocean basins were deeper, mountains were higher and more numerous. We see islands made from igneous rock all over. That's rock made from volcanic activity, as well as sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is rock laid down by water, moving water. There are mountains made of sedimentary rock. In other words, that's rock laid down by water. Well, how are you going to have a mountain laid down by water if the water wasn't at one time on top of the mountain, right? So a worldwide flood makes perfect sense, I believe. Again, I'm not a scientist, but Christian scientists who have studied this, and they have done such a great work, I think. Men like Henry Morris and Ken Ham and Dr. John Whitcomb and others. And there's excellent, if you want to get an excellent commentary on Genesis, you could get Dr. Henry Morris's commentary called The Genesis Record. And Dr. Whitcomb and Morris teamed together and wrote a book called The Genesis Flood, I believe. So, and then there was tremendous erosion that took place. And what was formed from a lot of this tremendous erosion after the flood? The canyons, like the Grand Canyons, where this geologic column, and of course, evolutionary archaeologists say it takes millions of years to form these canyons. And they have this, this view that as you see that little river trickling at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, it's uniformly been trickling like that. That's called uniformitarianism. But no, the flood could have formed the entire geologic column. Henry Morris says this in 220 days. Just the amount of time it would have taken for all the water to recede from the flood. So then, after this flood, then the ark rested. Genesis chapter 8, verse 4 tells us where the ark rested. And where did it rest? It says, now read it carefully. Where did it rest? Genesis chapter 8, verse 4.
Upon the mountains of Ararat.
Upon the mountains. Now that's interesting, because you would think that one boat would land on one mountain somewhere. So, okay, but he doesn't say what mountain it landed on. It says the mountains. So he's saying that the ark rested in this region of Mount Ararat. That's how I read that. So it says it rested upon the mountains. Okay, so it was a mountainous region in northeastern Turkey, and here are some pictures of Mount Ararat as it is today. But as I was reading about this today, I discovered that this present mountain of Ararat, and here's the major peak, and there is a lesser one, these formed after the flood. It formed after the flood. Okay, and that's scientifically provable on how these mountains came to be. So I did put an article on our church Facebook page. You can read it. It's done by Answers in Genesis. And here's the link by Dr. Andrew Snelling. And the article is entitled, Is Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat? And his answer is no. But let's look at this quickly here. He says the present Mount Ararat is a post-flood volcanic mountain. Do you see the notes back there, brother?
Yes.
They're on the chair. If you could grab pages 17 to 28. And There is a seat up here if you want to grab it. Or if you want to sit there, you may. The notes are there, though, page 17 to 28 for this class. Make sure you're not getting the Acts notes. There's 2 different piles of notes there. Okay, so the present Mount Ararat on page 18 is a post-flood volcanic mountain which continued to erupt after the flood, recently, less than 200 years ago. So it's not an active volcano now. It last erupted about 200 years ago. As a volcanic mountain, it formed after the flood. It is possible that the ark has been buried under the volcanic ash of this mountain. Because remember, this did not exist as we see it now after the flood. So it could be the ark is down in there somewhere. Could be. Could be that it just disintegrated too. It could be that they broke up the ark and used it for wood to make fire. I mean, who knows? We don't know. But it has never been found. Actually, and after reading this article by Snelling, I kind of think it never will be. But, you know, I don't know, but that's my impression. So there have been these different eruptions at this site in 1840, 1783, 1450, and even back before that. And so one thing we can say scientifically, you're not going to take an airplane over Mount Ararat, this region, and let's say it's a warm day and the snow's melting. You're not going to see the ark under the snow. Why? Because this mountain didn't exist when the ark landed in the region of that mountains of Ararat. Okay, so there's I just cut and paste this picture from the article that I just mentioned, and I thought this was very interesting. So basically what you have here are the flood sediments at the bottom. Here, sorry, it's right here. Okay, so here, underneath the mountain, there are flood sediments. So this was left from the Noah's flood at Mount Ararat. And then on top of that, what happened is there were lava flows. There were lava flows on top of the flood sediments. So in other words, after the flood, there were other mountains in this region spewing out lava and covering this area with lava flows. So sometime after the flood waters drained off, Snelling says that flows of deposits from the lava came into this area. And then after that, Mount Ararat was formed on top of these lava flows, which again arose sometime after lava covered the region. Check this out. This is amazing. God does this. After lava covered the region, then lava flowed out of certain vents and I don't know, whatever was going on underneath the earth. Then more lava came out and formed these mountains as we see them today. And they spread on top of the plateau's lava layers. So I've even seen this a few years ago. There was some kind of somebody's on, making the news saying they found the Ark of the Covenant, and there's pictures, and then they study it a little more and they say, no, it was just a hoax. So be very careful, when you see things like that, because there's a strong chance that it's going to be a hoax. Okay, so that's what I found out about that. I thought that was an interesting article.
Pastor,
Yes.
What composes the flood sediments? What are the components of that?
Well, again, I'm not a geologist to know, but there are fossils in these sediments. It says here that those flood sediments are filled primarily with marine fossils from the destruction of life in the ocean and on the land. So, and it says it's similar, that these flood sediments are similar to the flood layers that we find other places around the earth. So that's why they're saying that this was actually laid down at the time of Noah's flood. Yeah. And then they know when that, in history, they can, and this is where geologists can tell us, when these different things occurred. But you could study that more if you like. Okay, but I think that was for our purposes. We went down. I was deep enough of a dive. But if you have any further questions, okay, okay. Okay, so let's now move then back into our book. He talks about an urban revolution. So, and this makes sense after the flood. Then, of course, you had Noah and you had his sons, and then we're going to see them proliferate around that region of the world. And he says that there were 4 major things that were essential to the development of this urban revolution on page 35, in that second paragraph down. And it was the rivers that stimulated the development of the civilizations there. Of course, that in Mesopotamia, the rivers were the Tigris and Euphrates. In Egypt, the Nile. So you had the development of these regions, especially in the world, and they contributed to 4 different things. He said number 1 was what? You see it in that second paragraph on page 35. See it? Under urban revolution. You see urban revolution? There's 4 things in that second paragraph. What are they? Communication, transportation, and then if you go down a little bit more, he said, moreover, the rivers provided abundance of water for irrigation. And then down a little, well, then he said civilization flowered through those things. So really 3 things. So the blank in number 1 is communication. Okay? Okay, so next page, or in our book on page 36, he has a very interesting little paragraph on the table of nations. And then under that is a map of where these different nations, where they migrated to. And of course, people, I think this answers incredibly questions that we all naturally have, is where did human civilization come from and how did we all get here, So the table of nations is letter C in our notes. You can fill that in on page 18, the table of nations. And the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10 is an incomparable, unique, and accurate list of what? What does it say in Genesis chapter 10 to summarize all of this in verse 31 and 32? Why don't we go to the end of this chapter just to see how he summarizes the whole of the chapter. Sister Jeannie, could you please read that? Genesis chapter 10, verses 31 and 32.
These are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. Okay, so
he talks about the different people groups that emerged from Noah and his 3 sons, and he says, and he puts these divisions upon them after their what? Families, different families, and that's the blank at the bottom of page 18. After their families, after their what? Tongues, which is what? Their language. Because this is in relationship what's going to happen in the very next chapter. It's the Tower of Babel. And what happens at the Tower of Babel is the confusion of the languages. So basically what's going on in Genesis 10 and 11 is the same thing that's going on in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. It's real, true history. But one gives greater detail of what was going on in the previous. In other words, chapter 1, you have the 6 days of creation, God resting at the beginning of chapter 2, but then in chapter 2, primarily, he gives more detail about that 6th day in the creation of the man and the woman. Here, you have the table of nations given in chapter 10 and the listing of them all, and then he gives greater detail of the main events that occurred at that time in history, which was the dividing of the nations at the Tower of Babel. But it was at the same period of time. Okay, so, but he divides the people here by their families, by their languages they speak, and in the lands that they live, and the nations that developed out of them. And you know what? I think that's important for us to remember. It's not about the pigmentation of their skin. There's no mention of that. Although, looking around this room, there were differences back then, just as there are today in skin color and perhaps appearance. But that's not how God divides them in that sense. They spoke different languages, they're in different families, they formed different nations, and they lived in different lands. Okay? So that should be the ethnicity differences we should focus upon. William Albright, page 19. He is a world-renowned archaeologist. From what I know, he wasn't a Christian, but he said that this table of nations stands absolutely alone in ancient literature, without a remote parallel. The table of nations remains an astonishingly accurate document. Now again, this is being spoken by a renowned archaeologist. So what we see in Genesis chapter 10, again, is incomparable. There's nothing like it in all of human literature that gives such precise information about the people groups that inhabited the ancient world right after the flood. So what we have here is truly, as we have in the Bible, it's a treasure. So he talks about this table of nations. He divides them into how many different families in all? 70. That's the blank on number 3. 70 different families in all. These families are the descendants of Noah, and then through Japheth, Ham, and Shem. And what does this show? This shows that the human race, there's a unity to it. So it shows the unity of the human race. I'm on number 4. You with me there? Number 4. Do you have all the blanks?
What's the blank for number 4?
Number 4, unity of the human race. Because all these 70 nations come from what? One family. They all come from Noah, and then either from Shem, Ham, or Japheth. So it shows the unity of the human race, but it also shows the division of the human race, as we already mentioned, by language, family, territory. And we see that today. We are one people. We are all of one blood. I don't care where you live. It's no different today. People do speak different languages. That's a reality. You know, the languages, God did a great, when God does something, he does it really, he goes all out, you know. He divided those languages, man, and he's like, I'm going to really divide you. And he did. And we are divided by language still, and nation, and families, you know, and so, but yet we're still one people. We're still one race. One race. I don't even like people say the different races came from Ham, Shem, and Japheth. I don't actually talk that language because I think there's one race. You know, it's the human race, and there's different ethnicities, different people groups. I prefer to use that terminology. So this is the oldest attempt, number 5, to explain the geographic distribution of the human race. And the thing that's amazing with this as well, as you read through this, if you look, for example, in verse 5, it says, in Genesis chapter 10, verse 5, Genesis chapter 10, verse 5, it says, these were the isles of the Gentiles. By these were the isles of the Gentiles, divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Okay, so the key word that I want to follow is family. And if you go down a little bit more, it says again, that's when he summarizes the children of Japheth, and then down in verse 20, he says, these are the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, in their nations. And then in verse 31, he says, these are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, and their lands, after their nations. Okay, so he repeats that. So these are the different families of the earth. And then when God calls Abraham, what does he say? In the very, 2 chapters later, Genesis chapter 12. What does he say in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3? He says, yeah, go ahead, Frida, could you read it, please?
And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed.
Okay, and what did we just read 1 chapter before, 2 chapters before this? Of these 70 families of the earth. And so God called one man out of all these nations that were developing, and he says, through you, I will bring forth a seed and all the families of the earth. There's no other way to read that except there's one Savior in the world. There's no way to read that other than that. And so for people to think that there's different religions for different people groups, that's not what the Bible teaches. Clearly, from beginning to end. So that's very powerful. You have to read it in that context. So number 6 is Abraham's seed would bring blessing to all these families of the earth. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Okay, so the descendants then of Japheth, that's letter A, the descendants of Japheth. And under Japheth, there are 14 names in all. And this includes, and well, actually our book has a good picture of this. I just put this up here. We're going to find certain names here in the time that we have. But in our book on page 36, do you have that? You see Japheth is in the orange. So you see where the Japhethites first settled and then where they spread to. Mostly into Europe and into Russia. Okay? So, northwest of Canaan, including Greece, Turkey, the Mediterranean islands. Japheth was the father of the Cimmerians, the Germans, the French, the Spanish, the British, the Scythians, which are the Russians, the Medes, the Turks, the Slavs, I can't say these words. Yeah, you can read it. They populated Europe and the Northeast. Okay, so that's Japheth. Now, the 7 Japhetic nations, and look at verse 2 of Genesis chapter 10, the sons of Japheth. And what are the 7 given there? The first one is Gomer. And he settled. Now let's follow. Let's follow. See if we could find Gomer and find it on your map there. But it's north of the Black Sea. Find the Black Sea, which is actually off your map. That's underneath. That would be Magog. But he has Gomer underneath, actually, just south of the Black Sea. But here, Gomer is north of the Black Sea, but in this region. So there's Gomer. Now, and two, we read Gomer later on in the book of Ezekiel, right? From the kings of the north. So it's the same. His descendants probably occupied Germany, France, Spain, the British Isles. And if you look at even one of Gomer's children, and if you skip down to verse 3, the sons of Gomer were who? Ashkenaz. Now, this comes from, they say that Ashkenaz was the founder of Germany. And I put this, Ashkenaz is associated with Germany, and to this day, German Jews are often called Ashkenazi. And there's someone in our midst who has a name that is derived from that Ashkenaz, Ashkenazi, who was a German Jew of descent or in this region. So it's very interesting. So even today, these names come down to us and are being used. So Ashkenaz is right there in verse 3. And he also mentions Togarmah. That's also in Ezekiel. That's in Genesis chapter 10, verse 3, Togarmah. That's also in Ezekiel 38. And actually, if you look at Genesis 10, verse 4, the next, some of the other sons, well, you know what? I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to our notes. So we have Gomer, and then number 2 is who? Magog. They live north of the Caspian Sea. And again, we have here Magog. Your book puts them down probably underneath it. Yeah, underneath as well, kind of next to
Some type of
Magog.
Japheth name at both.
Yeah, right underneath that. That's the Black Sea, by the way. That sea that's kind of like in the middle and cut off. That would be the Black Sea. By the way, right here is modern day Bulgaria. So we have people in our church who are from this area also. Bulgaria is over here. Okay, so Magog, they would be associated with the Russians. Madai, the Medes, settled south of the Caspian Sea. So here's the Caspian Sea over here. Here's Madai over here. And number 4 is Javan. The Ionians or Greeks are the descendants of Javan. That's the Hebrew name. Javan is the Hebrew name for Greek. Okay, so, and they settled in Greece. And look at verse number 4. And what name is familiar to you there?
Tarshish.
Tarshish. Why Tarshish? How do we know Tarshish? Who was going to go there? Jonah. Which was where? Where's Tarshish? It's Spain. Okay, so these were the descendants of people who became the Spaniards. Okay, so some of you are from Tarshish. Spanish descent, maybe. Okay. All right. Tubal. So some of these names also are in the Bible. Meshech, the Slavs, and Tiras. So these are all in this area. Tubal, Javan, Tiras, Gomer, Magog. Okay, so these are the descendants of Japheth. And then they had sons. So these were the sons of Japheth, and then it gave some of the grandsons of Japheth, and we're going to move on though. Go to Ham, the Hamitic nations. Okay, so what were the 4 Hamitic nations? Genesis chapter 10, verse 6. What are the 4 Hamitic nations given there? Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Canaan. And Canaan is mentioned after the flood as well. And God said, cursed be Canaan. So the Canaanites settled in Canaan land. And I'm going to read from number 4 there. East of the Mediterranean, the land later given to the Hebrews. Canaan begat Sidon, Heth. And actually look at verse 16 or verse 15 and 16. Genesis chapter 10, verse 15 and 16. It says, Canaan begat Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth. And then it says, and the what? And the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite. So what's interesting there is those are peoples. When you see those names, it's not talking about just one individual, but he's saying those people groups came out of Canaan. And those are familiar to us because those were some of the main ites that were in the land of Canaan. So, and you know what? One of the keys of reading the book of Genesis, who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. When did he write it? When they were in the wilderness. And so when he was writing it, he was preparing the people to do what? To get ready to go into the land of promise. So in writing the book of Genesis, he's telling his people, here's where, when we get into the land, here's the people we're going to meet there. We're going to meet these Canaanites and all these other ites there. And they're going to know exactly why people are there, their history of why the Edomites are there, why the Moabites are there, why the Ammonites are there, why the different Canaanite groups are there, and so forth. So he's preparing them for that conquest. Okay. Now the other thing I thought was interesting there, says, and I just read it. He says that in verse 17, he says the Sinite. So Sinite is Mount Sinai. Let's see, where am I? Oh, Mount Sinai is right here. So the Sinai probably settled in what we would call Mount Sinai. Okay? So I put that in your notes. That's a blank. The Sinai, those who inhabited the region of Mount Sinai. Okay, so the Hamitic nations were number one. You put Cush, that's number one. You got that in the blank?
Yes.
And number 4 is who? Canaan. And then the other blank under number 4 is Mount Sinai.
Excuse me, the black 4B before that.
Ham, the descendants of Ham.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so of the 70 nations, you have Japheth, and 14 names are given in relationship to Japheth. 14 of the nations. Then you have Ham. How many nations given in relation to Ham? 30. So they were very prolific. And Ham became the father of the Ethiopians, the Egyptians, the Libyans, the Canaanites. So they populated. Here we see Mizraim. In this area, here's Cush down here. And do you see it on your map also? You see Cush?
Mm-hmm.
You see Mizraim? Okay. So it's nice, again, this is why we're doing this class, to see. Here's Cush, here's Mizraim, here's Put, and then of course Canaan, in this Canaan region. Canaan was named after this son, as some of these other areas were named after these sons.
Pastor, where's Shinar?
Shinar. Shinar is in the. We're going to come into Shinar when we see the battle of Abraham against those kings, who came down from the east. But Shinar.
Right below Babylon, Shem area.
Is it on the map here?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, Shinar is on the map. It's right below Babylon in the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia. Yeah, it is listed there, Shinar.
So Ham went into that area also, because it said here in verse 11 that he went to Assyria and
Yeah, so there seems to be some overlap. It wasn't like so there seemed to be definitely some overlap as well between the sons. So the sons of Ham here are in a region where there are mostly Shemites, in other words. Because even here, if you look on this map, it has Cush over here, and it has Cush down here. So they could have moved to different places. And one of the books I was reading talked even about the Canaanites who settled in Mount Sinai area, that they were adventurous people, and they liked the oceans and the seas and this and that. And so that there could be some, and you could study this. This is not my area of expertise at all, but I'm just saying what the book said is that perhaps the descendants of China came from the Sinai. There was maybe a relationship between them, so that that's what it said. So actually, that if that is true, then the Chinese people come from Ham, because that was a descendant of the Hamites. Okay, so let's just try to finish this off here. I know I'm going over my time, but there's a lot to cover on this. Is the 5 Semitic nations of Shem then? So letter C is the descendants of Shem. So here we see 26 names related to Shem. So if you add up the 26 names of Shem and the 30 names of Ham and the 14 names of Japheth, that's where you get 70. Okay, so in our notes, I'm just putting the sons and not all of the grandchildren and the descendants past them, okay? So the sons of Shem were who? In verses 21 and following, verse 21 especially, unto Shem also, the father of all the children. Elam, it's on page, verse 22, the children of Shem. Elam and Ashur, and the Assyrians came from them. And Arphaxad, now that's on the top of page 21, and I made that a blank, and you have to know, now obviously you're not going to have to know all this, all right? This is just for our understanding. Because again, when have you ever heard a message on Genesis chapter 10? I know one thing, I've never, so open your Bibles at Genesis 10, you know? This is serious stuff. I mean, this is like Bible study. But Arphaxad is the ancestor of who? Of Abraham. So that's why I want you to know Arphaxad. He's the line of Seth. That's page 20, top of page 21. That's the line of Seth, or Shem, you know, Shem through Seth, the godly line. And so if you even look here in, okay, look at verse 20, look at chapter 10, verse 24. Arphaxad begat Selah. Selah begat Eber. And what name derives from Eber? Hebrew. And unto Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. Okay, so now if you go down over to, go to chapter 11, where, again, I'm piecing this together. I hope I don't lose you too much, but.
What is number 3 answer?
I'm sorry?
The third answer.
Arphaxad, number 3 at the top of page 21.
Yeah.
Arphaxad, Arphaxad. Arphaxad. So he's in the line. Abraham is going to come from Arphaxad. Okay, and if you look in page chapter 11, now go to Genesis chapter 11 and verse 11. It's giving this godly line. And he gives, and here's the amazing thing. Here's the amazing thing. A genealogy is given, beginning with Adam, all the way to Abraham. And it tells how old the person was when he had his first son. So we know how old the earth is. And there's no gaps. There's no gaps in there. And actually the genealogy is in Luke. In Christ as well. So the genealogy is established. But here's the genealogy in verse 11. It says, Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years, and then Arphaxad lived 35 years, and Selah, and Arphaxad lived, and it tells you how long he lived, and then Selah lived, and then he had Eber. So this is the line, this is the godly line. He's bringing you to Abraham. Okay, so Abraham is going to come out of Arphaxad. So again, here's the sons of Shem. Let's try to find these guys. Here's Elam over here. Here's Ashur right here. Here's Arphaxad, which is right in the area of the Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham is going to come out of that region of Babylon, of Mesopotamia. And here's Lud. Where's Lud? Over here. And our book has Ludim over there. And then Aram of the Assyrians. He's over here, Aram. Okay, so all the names are up here. All the names are in your book, in this map as well. At least all the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay, so we're over our time. So